this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Aerial mining by RAF Bomber Command played a crucial role in the Allied war effort, sinking far more Axis shipping than direct attacks by either Coastal Command or Bomber Command itself. Minelaying operations began in April 1940 and expanded significantly. Yet today, this critical campaign, along with its impact on Axis merchant vessels, Kriegsmarine warships and U-boats, remains largely overlooked. I'm Angus Wallace, and this is the World War II podcast. Today, joining me is Jane Gulliford Lowes, author of The Invisible Campaign, Assessing Bomber Command's Minelaying Operations 1940 to 45. So in this episode, we'll be exploring the RAF minelaying efforts during the war, their strategic importance, and why they've been so often forgotten. Jane, welcome. So before we get to the specifics of the RAF operations, I thought it would be useful to start with some of the broader historical context on naval mining. I have to admit, until I began thinking about this topic, I hadn't given mines much thought beyond the old decommissioned ones you see on British seafronts that are now used for those charity collection boxes for the lifeboat service. And thinking about it, I'm not even sure if those are from the Second World War.
Yeah, and the naval mines, yeah.
So when were mines first developed? I know they were used during the First World War. I'm not sure if they were dropping them from planes.
Mining goes right back to the sort of the origins of it, go right back to sort of 16th, 17th century. And there's records of it in the American Civil War and stuff as well. So people have always tried to blow up ships by floating objects, basically. It's always been a thing. But then, it developed massively, obviously, in the First World War. And then people began to realise, well, there's got to be ways of getting mines into position closer to enemy harbours, estuaries and ports and stuff by dropping them by aircraft. It was certainly in the idea stage during the First World War, but then it was in the interwar years that this really began to develop. Of all people, it was Arthur Harris who contacted the Admiralty in sort of 1936 and said, I really think we need to be thinking about developing a mine that we can lay from the air. So let's just talk about the difference between naval mines and air-laid mines. Because whenever people think about mines, right, the first thing they think about is those big black spherical objects with the knobbles on that you see on all these World War II films, you know, where some poor guy in a dinghy is trying to push it away with an oar. That is absolutely not what we're talking about here. That is a naval mine, and you absolutely would not want one of those in the bomb bay of your Halifax or Lancaster, because these are contact mines, they explode on contact. When we're talking about air-laid mines, we are talking about specially developed devices which are laid by aircraft. These are long cylindrical objects, and they contain special arming mechanisms and special triggers. Now, normally these are acoustic mines or magnetic mines. I'll just briefly explain the difference. So an acoustic mine lies on the bottom of the seabed. It can lurk there for months, possibly even years, and it is triggered by the sound of a ship's engine passing overhead. And what it then does, it explodes on the seabed, and it creates a massive pressure wave. And it's the pressure wave which basically breaks the back of the ship, which is passing overhead. So there's no sort of big fancy explosions, nothing like that. It's a really devious device. And then the other type is the magnetic mine. And this, again, is triggered by the passing overhead of a large metal object, i.e. a boat or ship. So these things just lie on the seabed. But because of that, they are designed to work in fairly shallow water. So we're talking about harbours, we're talking about rivers, canals even. We are talking about estuaries, the entrances to U-boat pens, that sort of thing. You're not laying these out in the deep ocean. Why would you do that? That's what the Navy's for. So it's getting into places that naval craft can't reach to lay mines. Now, this gives you another advantage as well, because it means that you can also go back and lay more mines later on, which you can't do with a ship because you're not going to sail through your own minefield that you've just planted, are you? But in this instance, aircraft can keep going back. They can keep replenishing the mines because obviously the Germans know that mines have been laid. They can see the aircraft coming. And so they will sweep the minefields to clear them. So the aircraft just come back and lay more the next day. So it's this constant sort of war of attrition, if you like, of mine laying and mine clearance. And that's how it works.
When Harris is suggesting this, in those late 30s, what's interesting about that is Harris is in the RAF. In my mind, mine laying would be a naval operation. Is this a land grab for the RAF to take on more responsibilities to get more funding, which oddly it did occur to me in a time when nobody wants to spend money, buying planes to drop mines is possibly cheaper than buying ships to do it.
This is the whole point, and ultimately that's exactly what happens in the long term. I think we often criticise Harris for being a very narrowly focused man, just strategic bombing is the be-all and end-all. But when you actually get into the archives and when you actually look at the papers, I think he's very much a bigger picture man because he can see from the very, very outset, this weapon has the potential to create havoc amongst enemy shipping and attack enemy transport routes and logistics. And that is going to seg nicely and work in sort of synchronicity with strategic bombing. So it's about making life as difficult as you possibly can for your enemy, whether that's at sea, in the air, or on the ground. And all of these things sort of seg together. I think we have such a tendency to, well, as historians generally, just to view individual campaigns in isolation, don't we? Like we look at strategic bombing, or we look at the Italian campaign, or we look at North Africa, or we look at the Far East or whatever. We just sort of examine them almost as a sort of microcosm, but we shouldn't do that because they're all part and parcel of the same thing. Like the Battle of the Atlantic, for example, I mean, mine laying fits into there perfectly, as we'll discuss later on. But in getting back to your point, yes, there is this massive debate and massive discussion between the Navy and between the RAF and the Air Ministry as to who is going to develop this weapon, who is going to have this responsibility, who is going to be in charge of any mine-laying campaign? Because obviously the Navy is saying, oh, it's at sea, it involves ships, therefore it should be us. But Harris is saying, well, no, actually, it's going to be my aircraft, or RAF aircraft, which are going to be laying these mines. And eventually there's this massive bust-up, which the politicians eventually have to sort out in about 1938. And they're still arguing about it right up to the beginning of the war. But once war breaks out, they actually realise, okay, we've got to stop arguing. We've got to reach a compromise here. So what happens is that it's agreed that the Navy will build and develop these mines and the RAF will deliver them. So basically the Navy are calling the shots, but the RAF are delivering those shots. What happens is that the Navy will say, we're observing shipping movements off the coast of Norway or whatever. We know that there's fleets coming in, doing this, that, and the other, that the subs operating here, there, and everywhere. We think we could do with some mines being laid here. This is the tide times. This is the best time to do it. Bomber Command, over to you. So Bomber Command will then say, yeah, okay, we'll do that, but it's subject to what else we've got on at the time. If we've got a big operation on bombing Bremen or whatever, then the mining is going to have to take a back seat. But ultimately, this cooperation works perfectly despite all the massive barneys and bust-ups that they had throughout the late 30s. When they actually get this system up and running, it works like a dream.
Presumably, once you're at war, the arguments over budgets are less of a problem when you just need to get a job done, which helps smooth over who's getting what in that interwar world where money's tight. What's curious is the Germans must be having the same arguments because they kick off the mine laying in the Second World War. They're dropping them in the autumn of 1939.
That's right. They've stolen a march on the British. They've got the same ideas, basically, but their preparations are further ahead than the British. They're about 6 months ahead. There's often this myth that, the British see the Germans dropping these air-laid mines in the autumn of 1939 and see it causing absolute devastation to British coastal shipping and think, oh, we need a mine like this. We should be doing the same. But that's not the case. This mine had been in development since about, 37, 38. It just wasn't quite ready to be delivered at this particular point in time. So yes, the Germans are ahead of us at this particular point in time, and it's causing absolute devastation. So Harris and the Air Ministry are kind of mindful that this amount of devastation is being caused to our shipping fleets. We need to be doing the same. But what enormous potential this weapon has got, because they can see, the results, unfortunately, as to what's happening in British ports and harbours. And they think, well, we can do this ourselves, but on a much, much bigger scale, which is exactly what happens.
Were the Germans just aiming to close down access to ports? Was that their campaign?
Partially, yeah. They are basically just trying to cause as much disruption to British shipping. It's mainly merchant shipping that they're targeting, as opposed to naval shipping. It's basically just causing disruption, impacting supply lines, impacting imports, that sort of thing, disrupting trade, disrupting logistics. So they are destroying ships all down the east coast and all down the south coast. So, for example, where I live in the northeast of England, they are trying to destroy colliers, vessels coming down from the northeast with tons and tons of coal to supply London and to supply heavy industry elsewhere. So any sort of merchant shipping is basically under attack by the Germans at this point in the campaign.
Well, presumably in that autumn, Britain has quite a large coast where before the fall of France, German targets are limited by the fact that their exposure to the coast of the North Sea and the channels are a lot less than post fall of France in 1940, which must have really kick-started, supercharged perhaps the opportunities for mine laying for the RAF. That must have really changed things.
Turn it on its head a little bit. As far as the occupation of Northern Europe is concerned, it gives the Germans increased opportunities because obviously they're now occupying ports in Denmark and Norway, which then gives them access to the British East Coast, particularly the north of the East Coast. So there is an increase at that point. But then, yes, certainly when they invade France, they're occupying an area which stretches from the French Atlantic coast all the way up to Arctic Norway. So that the opportunities that then opens up for the RAF to attack German supply lines and logistics, which are obviously they are stretched at this point in time, is enormous. But by the same token, that means that the RAF are thinking, oh God, where do we attack next? Because there's such vast scope. It's such a huge area to be dealt with. Where do they best focus their resources?
So what are the aims of that campaign? Because I guess you could look at military targets. Are they trying to bottle up the Kriegsmarine? Are they trying to, I don't know, Germany's very reliant on iron ore from Sweden? I'm not sure what comes from France, but presumably submarines in France. I mean, do they have a strategy behind their campaign? Are they trying to make it economic? This
is basically economic warfare. So they are targeting merchant ships coming down from Narvik in Norway with all the iron ore, etc., which is being mined in Sweden. They are targeting troop ships going backwards and forwards across the Baltic, up to Norway, and then obviously from 1941 onwards, eastwards into Russia. They are targeting just general logistics, just moving around of men, material, equipment, raw materials all around the coastal routes. Because if you look at Germany's North Sea coast isn't massive because obviously it's got Denmark sticking up out the middle of it. So there's so much trade which goes around the coast. It has to go around the coast of Denmark, has to go around the coast of southern Norway and Sweden. And all of this is just a prime target for the RAF because these channels are so narrow. If you look at a map, you've got Denmark and Sweden and Norway, the areas that you've got to actually sail through are so narrowly straight, and that is absolutely perfect for mine laying. And when the campaign kicks off in April 1940, that's the area that they are focusing on, and it causes absolute havoc from the get-go. It's mine laying by Bomber Command around these waters, which cause the Germans to adopt a convoy system. Now, we hear lots about the British and Allied convoys, don't we? But no one ever talks about the German convoys, but they did employ a convoy system, obviously to a smaller degree, particularly escorting vessels from Germany all the way up to northern Norway, because the area is now littered with mines, both naval and air-laid. Obviously, the subs operating as well. And so they have to employ escort vessels, and they have to employ minesweepers to clear the way to ensure that those vessels can get there safely.
The dominance of the Royal Navy must mean that any merchantman can't go far out to sea because they'll get hit by the British Navy. So they have to hug the coast, which then plays into the fact that it's been mine laying. So it becomes sort of a synergy between the mine laying and the Royal Navy.
Yeah, it's just this beautiful sort of complementary campaign, if you like. It just segs together so beautifully. It really does.
In a wonderful piece of British understatement, these were called gardening missions. Where does the phrase come from?
So late March, early April 1940, when the campaign is about to kick off. Obviously, we don't know that the Germans are about to invade Norway at this point in time, but that's an aside. The Air Ministry and the RAF decide, hang on, we need some sort of code for these operations that we're going to be carrying out. We can't say that we're laying mines because, the Germans will intercept those signals or pick up on the signals chatter, etc. They'll know straight away what we're doing. So we need to come up with some code words, basically, for what we're doing. And some bright spark came up with the idea of calling it gardening, because we're basically sowing or planting mines. So they devised a scheme whereby the sea was basically divided up into different minefields, and each of these was given a horticultural name. So you have nasturtiums, you have nectarines, you have onions, all sorts of weird and wonderful. Forget-me-nots, that's one of my favourites, forget-me-nots and daffodils, yeah. These are the names for the minefields. And so the mines themselves are then called vegetables. You'll get a code message saying, number 83 squadron, can you please plant 83 artichokes in daffodils? And the Germans are kind of going, what the hell? What on earth is this? So listening, it's a perfectly and so British way of doing things. I absolutely love it. It's great.
It's so non-aggressive. It's the way the British name operations and things like that is just sort of flippant. Whereas if it was Americans, they'd come up with something much more aggressive and kind of morale boosting. Yeah, we're seeding onions into geraniums, the flower beds kind of things. It's just, it's absolutely fantastic. How do you lay a minefield? How many sort of planes and sorties are involved in these things?
Well, initially in 1940, it begins on a very, very small scale. So you might only have, say, 5 or 6 aircraft going out one particular night, but they will be targeting just a very, very small area. So these minefields are very, very small, but they're very, very close to the coast. So they will proceed to fly over, drop their mines, but this has to be done from a very, very low height at this point in time. So we don't have the technology and the accuracy to drop mines from a significant height. One of the reasons that they've got to be laid from a low altitude is that to prevent damage to the arming mechanisms when they drop and hit the water. So to slow their descent, they are all fitted with a parachute, which when they are dropped from the aircraft, pulls out and basically slows them down so that they then drop into the water vertically rather than hitting it, horizontally, and then just gently descend into the water. And then they will lie on the floor of the seabed. And they have what's called a saltwater arming mechanism. It's basically like a plug inside the mine, which is dissolved by the seawater. And once that plug is dissolved, it arms itself. Brilliant. Absolute genius.
That means, presumably, they could delay the mine to any length they want.
There's all sorts of crafty techniques that they've got here so that the mine can be delayed so that it doesn't sort of trigger itself for, a couple of months even. Eventually, they develop mines which will disarm themselves after 50 days or whatever. But you've also got mechanisms whereby, say, for example, a magnetic mine, it can lie there, be passed over by ships 5 or 6 times, and it is programmed only to trigger on the 7th passing of a vessel. So this means that the Germans are sweeping the area. They think they've got all the mines up, etc. There are no explosions, nothing is going on. And then all of a sudden, the German merchant vessel sails over 2-3 months later, bang, gone. So it's really clever, really, really crafty. And eventually, throughout the course of the war, these mechanisms become increasingly more technical, increasingly more devious. And eventually you get combination mines, which have both the acoustic and the magnetic devices in them. And they're just becoming impossible to detect for the Germans, and impossible to sweep. It's really, really devious.
How accurately could they drop these mines? Because, I mean, in some respect, they're flying at night, but I guess you're not necessarily, as you say, they're not necessarily out to sea. So then do they manage to keep, but each plane can only carry so many mines. So are these mine fields, or is that giving it borders that might not be there because there was an inaccuracy to the operations?
They are fairly accurate because they are given very, very specific coordinates by the Navy in which to leave these mines. Because obviously, by the same token, you don't want to jeopardize or create a hazard for any Allied shipping or submarines that might be operating in the area. So we need to know where these are. They're laid to very, very specific coordinates. And if, for example, an aircraft is unable to locate the precise coordinates because of bad weather or whatever, they are told to come home and bring their mines back with them. They have to bring them back again because these are such expensive, such technical pieces of kit. It's not like the Bomber Command, coming back from a mission to you just dump your ordnance in the North Sea before you come home. Because the mines obviously won't arm themselves until they're in the water, technically, it's safe to bring them back so that they can be reused when the weather's better or whatever. So by and large, they are laying to a very, very specific coordinate, and they are also doing it from a very, very low altitude initially. We're talking about probably between 500 and 1,500 feet in 1940. That gets higher and higher as the technology gets better. But by the end of the war, they're doing it from 15,000 feet. But yeah, initially, it is incredibly dangerous, By 42, Harris is aiming to drop 1,000 mines a month, which is a tremendous amount of mines. So are these missions done by regular crews? Do we have bases just put aside for mine-laying ops, or are they mixing and matching all the crews? They're mixing and matching. If you look at any Bomber Command logbook from sort of, I would say, 42, 43 onwards, you will see that most crews have done at least one or two mine-laying ops in the course of their tour of operations. Basically, everybody is on board with this. Initially, it's just Fire Group and the Hampdens who are doing it because they're the only aircraft which have the capability to lay mines. They're the only ones which can be adapted. But then eventually, it's rolled out to the entirety of Bomber Command. And every aircraft the Bomber Command flies is adapted so that it can lay mines. That is the scale of the operation that we're talking about. So just about every group will lay mines. Most squadrons, the Canadian squadrons in particular, are doing a lot of this from 6th Group, from sort of late 44 onwards. Everybody is involved at some point in time. There are no specialist mine-laying crews. That's a resource and a luxury that Bomber Command just doesn't have. So basically, everybody has to get involved. But Harris, when he takes control of command of Bomber Command in 1942, he has a great way of dealing with this. He comes up with a policy that Bomber Command will bomb in good weather and mine in bad. So when the weather's too bad to send your bomber fleets out to Germany, instead, you'll be sending some squadrons out to do mine laying around the coasts instead. So these guys are going out in the most appalling conditions when the rest of the bomber force are tucked up safely in bed.
What does that mean for risk for these crews? I mean, what's again slightly flippant. You go, they're off on gardening missions, which makes it sound like an easy mission.
This is one of the great myths, and something which I'm really, really keen to address in the book, is gardening is an easy option. It absolutely is not. I think there's this misconception that gardening operations involve, just flying over a patch of ocean somewhere, dropping a few mines and coming home for tea and biscuits later on. It's absolutely not that. You are coming right in close to enemy coasts, by the very, very nature as the operation, you are right in close to enemy coasts and harbours. You are generally within the range of enemy anti-aircraft, land-based anti-aircraft fire. For the guys who are mine laying in the Baltic, so sort of Kiel Bay, Danzig, that sort of area, they've got to fly over northern Germany and or over occupied Denmark to get that. And it's incredibly hazardous. And losses, particularly of the Eastern Gardens, are very, very high. There's very little difference in the attrition and loss rate between guarding operations and bombing operations when you sort of average it out as a whole. It's around about the 3% mark, 3 to 4% mark. If you are perhaps going down to Biscay, to La Palisse, La Rochelle, Brest, Bordeaux, whatever, and targeting the submarine bases, yes, you're not going to get as much opposition. Most of the time you will be flying over the sea. You're not going to be flying over enemy territory. So the losses on the Western Gardens are lower, but losses are so high, sort of 42, getting into early 43, that Harris commissions a report from the operational research section to what's going on here, why losses in the Eastern Gardens so high as compared to the West. And numbers of factors really, but one of the main problems is that you're having inexperienced crews sent out there. So guys who are perhaps on their first or second mission. There was a policy adopted from quite early on that rookie crews should be sent on guarding ops for the first couple of operations, just to get a feel of the aircraft, how to deal with anti-aircraft fire if they come across it. But that was a policy which really waxed and waned throughout the course of the war, depending on operational requirements. So say, for example, 10 Squadron, 1943, I think they have something like, is it 100 and odd new crews join in the course of that year? One crew is given the opportunity to go on a guarding op as its first operation. So it's completely dependent on what the operational requirements are at the time. So to say that all crews were sent out on a guarding op, just to get the feel of it for their first op, ease them in gently, it's completely untrue. Some did, but by and large, that just wasn't the case. And also, they quickly realised, particularly after this operational research was done, that they needed the experienced crews to go to the Eastern Gardens because they're the guys who know how to deal with night fighters. They know how to take the evasive action from searchlights. They know how to get out of the way of flat guns, etc. So that's the policy that was basically changed. And the more experienced crews were sent east, the less experienced crews were sent west, where they would probably encounter less opposition.
Are they flying day missions or night missions?
All at night. Always at night. Well, at night, it's generally starts at dusk and it keeps on going until dawn. But bizarrely, one of the ideas of mining is that you almost kind of want the enemy to know what you're doing. You want them to know that you've just laid mines outside their submarine base, because then you know that they're going to have to get all their minesweepers out. They're going to have to trek up and down. They're going to have to delay the sailing of their U-boat fleet until the channels are cleared. So it's all about forcing the enemy to divert his resources and expend as much time, energy, money, and manpower as possible in having to clear these mines. To such an extent that the German minesweeping force was expanded by about 40%, I think, around about 43, 44. Because they just cannot cope with the amount of mines that are being laid. We're talking over 1,000 a month, and it's causing absolute chaos.
It's the unsurprise of the surprise is what they're sort of after. You mentioned Hamptons were initial mine layers. They're certainly not heavy bombers, but how much do the heavies change it when they start coming online from, was it 42?
Massively, because they can carry a much bigger load of mines. So typically, Halifax will take 4 mines. Lancaster will take 4, but later it was adapted to take 6. So that's a complete game changer. Because initially the Hamptons are only taking 1, later 2 maybe. But you've also got Coastal Command and Fleet Air Arm chipping in the early stages as well. So you've even got swordfish laying mines off the coast of northern France, which is just wonderful. Yeah, Swordfish is a much maligned aircraft, and I think it's absolutely fantastic.
This is biplanes.
Yeah. But the problem with this is that Coastal Command are taking very heavy losses from mine-laying operations from sort of between 40 and 42. And eventually a deal is done with Bomber Command that the Coastal Command will pretty much opt out of this. That suits Harris fine because he wants complete control of the picture anyway. He's quite happy for his bombers to keep on doing that. So there's this myth that Harris hates mine-laying. And I think, as I've demonstrated from the outset, Harris was involved in this from the very, very beginning. It was one of his babies, and he ensured that no matter what else was going on, mine laying could continue because he saw it as complementary and completely synergist to what Bomber Command were trying to do, particularly in terms of disrupting enemy transport networks. You've got your heavy bombers targeting marshalling yards, railway lines, ports, etc. That means that you are then forcing trade out on the coastal sea routes, which means that that's perfect for the mine layers because then you can just disrupt that completely by looking at a few merchant ships every week. This lovely sort of synergist thing, everything sort of segs together beautifully as we go on through about the course of the war.
So when does it start to wind down? Because presumably post D-Day, we're wanting access to ports that we're hoping to recapture. So does that sort of spell the end?
No, absolutely not. This is where the clever bit comes in. All of the mines that were, I think, was it something like 17,000 mines are laid between the Navy and between Bomber Command and the run up to D-Day or around the coast of northern France. But these mines have what's called sterilizers on them. So after a set period, say 30 days or whatever, they will deactivate. So that area then becomes safe for Allied shipping to come in. It's genius. So you don't have that problem. But no, actually mine laying is stepped up even further, sort of late 44, particularly around the coasts of Denmark and northern Germany and Norway, because they're very, very keen to pen in the U-boats and stopping them getting out of their bases to come and attack basically the supply routes and the logistics, the massive amount of men and equipment which is still coming across the channel and throughout late 44. So the mine laying has a contribution to make there as well. So it continues right up to the beginning of May 1945.
It's very clever, and it must have taken a lot of planning that doesn't get mentioned with the people who are planning the land campaign to say, look, when do we think these ports will be open? We will bomb and hopefully, our mines will be not working by then, so you'll be free. So there's sort of again, synergy is a word we keep using of the campaign, which is interesting. Which again, never gets mentioned, does it?
It doesn't. No, I mean, the planning stage of this was absolutely enormous, and the amount of detail and depth that has to be gone into, because the army need to know where it's going to be safe for them to come ashore. Bomber Command need to know where they're going to be laying mines, where they're going to be bombing. The Navy need to know, well, how are we going to get these people there in the first place? So yeah, the amount of sort of coordination which is required is unreal. And the detail, if you look at the plans, it's absolutely finite with regard to, the number of mines that will be laid in this particular area on this particular day, and then they will be sterilised by D-Day plus 14 days so that you can then come in with this equipment and these vessels here or whatever. The planning is unbelievable, but it works perfect.
The other oddity is, it just occurred to me that you have to be seen to continue mining in the run-up to D-Day, so you can't not mine an area that you previously mined because you know going to land there.
You've got to keep on mining so that, the Germans are going to get suspicious and think, why have they suddenly stopped mining around Cherbourg or whatever. Yeah, you've got to keep on going because you don't want to give the game away.
Jane, we're going to pause there. Folks, we'll be back in a moment. When it comes to success, do we have a figure with any accuracy to the success of the campaign?
We have a range of figures, I think, it's in terms of the number of vessels sunk. Because one of the difficulties you have is that if a German supply ship goes down off Stavanger in March 1944, and nobody actually sees it go down, how do you know why it's been sunk? Has it been a submarine? Has it been torpedoed? Has it been just sunk due to bad weather? They kind of come up with a rule that if a ship goes down and there's no other immediate obvious cause, and it's in an area where mines are being laid, then it will be attributed to, that loss will be attributed to an air-laid mine. There's actually a committee set up to determine which vessels have been sunk by what means.
Was that post-war?
No, during the war.
So there's like a feedback loop throughout the war.
Yeah, it's called the Enemy Shipping Losses Committee, yeah. And they sit sort of every week and say, oh, well, the SS Munich went down on whatever date. Where did it go down? What was happening? Did we have any submarines in the vicinity? No. Well, we'd air-laid mines there 6 weeks before. Must have been that. Therefore, we'll attribute it to a mine. So, yeah, it's all quite closely controlled. The main intelligence comes from people sort of on land. So you've got particularly Norwegians. You've got lots of intelligence coming from Norway, coming through Sweden as to what shipping losses are actually occurring as well, a little bit from Denmark as well. But eventually, taking all of these things into account, the range of figures between various different sort of people who've studied this and the Shipping Losses Assessment Committee at the time is between about 640 and about 860, which is a lot of ships sunk. I tend to go for a figure broadly between the two. You've got to pick a figure, haven't you? And they're all so different. So I tend to sort of go for around about 750 is a nice figure to work from. But I mean, that's huge. That's absolutely huge. But when you compare the impact of mine laying against direct attacks, mine laying is a much more economic and a much more effective way of going about targeting enemy shipping. Direct attacks, so I'm talking about bombing attacks or torpedo attacks by both Bomber Command and Coastal Command and the Air Arm, is very, very expensive. It takes around 104 direct sorties to sink one vessel. Mine laying takes about 31 sorties to sink a vessel. And in terms of the aircraft sunk, you are looking at around about 857 aircraft lost in direct attacks. And for mine laying, it's around half that. So it's a much more economic way of dealing with enemy shipping. And this is something which the Americans pick up on as well, because this well aware of the success of the RAF's mine laying operations. And this is a tactic which they then adopt around the coast of Japan in late 44, early 45 in Operation Starvation. And they have a massively successful mine laying campaign. I think they destroy something like 2 million tons of Japanese shipping for the loss of about 50 aircraft. So yeah, it is hugely, hugely successful.
And that's if you're viewing success through tonnage sunk. I mean, success could be U-boat operations that didn't happen. And I'm not sure how you even equate that, nuisance. It's
not all about sinking vessels, mine laying. It's all about being a massive pain in the arse to the enemy, basically. But that's ultimately what it's all about. Making your enemy's life as difficult as you possibly can by disrupting its logistics, disrupting its supply lines, forcing it to divert its resources to deal with it. So say, for example, the impact on the U-boats. I think there's only a handful of U-boats are actually sunk by air-laid mines. But the impact on the logistics and the operations is enormous, because it means that they can't get out into the areas of the Baltic that they need to. They can't get out into the training grounds to work up the new U-boats. Their movements are very, very restricted. And eventually they're sort of hemmed into a smaller and smaller area where they can actually work up these new U-boats. 1945, the Germans built 91 new U-boats in the first 4 months of 1945, right? But they've got no one to crew them. They've got nowhere them to go. They can't get them out. And again, that's down to mine laying. And again, as I've mentioned, the expansion of the German minesweeping force. The RAF are forcing the Germans to build more minesweepers. They are forcing them to crew those minesweepers. Perhaps these men could be better employed elsewhere. They are forcing the Germans to take anti-aircraft weapons away from the Eastern Front, away from other fronts, to put them in ports and harbours to basically try and fend off the mine layers. It's all about this diversion of resources. But you even see economic factors as well, such as increase in marine insurance rates, because nobody wants to insure merchant shipping because they're all getting so you're just disappearing in the middle of the night. You are getting to the point where neutral crews, because remember, a lot of German merchant ships are crewed by Swedes and people from all over Scandinavia, as well as from the occupied countries as well. It's getting so dangerous that they are refusing to sail. They're just not doing it. On the Danube, we haven't even mentioned the Danube, but there's a lot of mine laying takes place in the Danube in the summer of 44, because it's the main sea route, obviously, from Germany to the Black Sea. And it's where the oil fields are, Ploesti in Romania. It's where the synthetic oil plants are. And so massive disruption is caused to the transportation of oil up the Danube and into Germany by Bomber Command Minelaying. So again, that's something else that the people don't think about. So there are so many different factors, and you are also targeting and having an impact on the amount of raw materials, because some comes in from Spain and to southern France, but particularly from Scandinavia. All that iron ore coming from Narvik and bauxite and all the other stuff which is being mined and brought in. It's having an impact on the flow of raw materials. You want it to get to the Ruhr. It's never going to get there if all of this massive disruption is going on, combined with bombing attacks on transport routes. It all just fits together, this giant jigsaw.
And presumably, as you close down and restrict naval routes, that puts it onto trains, which can't carry as much. So again, you're restricting the flow on a train network that's already being used for military transportation.
Yeah, and it's being heavily bombed and disrupted, yeah.
Contracting that supply line. Considering, as you pointed out, almost every crew must have done mine-laying operations. Why are they now overlooked? I was thinking about my uncle, who we think was only third tour by the end of the war. But he talked about bombing. My uncle bombed everywhere and was very keen to tell you how he'd bombed everywhere. Never recall him mentioning a mine-laying operation.
The crews didn't talk about them because, as far as they were concerned, they were seen as unglamorous. There's no end result for the crew. They're not seeing some massive explosion, some factory going up. They might see a splash in the water if they're lucky. Go home again if they don't get shut down on the way back. And that's it. They don't know what the result of their mine laying has been. That mine might never have any impact. It could blow up a ship the next night or in 3 months' time. They don't ever know.
It's curious, though, how risky the operation are, and they're still not remembering them. You'd have thought the remembrance would be based on risk, but I see the point of you're not seeing Berlin in flames.
I think as well, because a lot of their tours were relatively short. I mean, the average tour is between 4 and 6 months. They're not getting to know about the results of the mining that they did. Yeah, they might hear about, there's been a massive ship sunk where Bomber Command dropped mines 6 months ago, but that wasn't them. That was the crew that was in there in this down, 6 months ago or whatever. All the time, there's this massive fight for publicity by Harris to try and get his mine-laying crew some recognition. But because it's seen as routine and unglamorous, it's not really interested. And I think that really plays into it as well. So you have, these publications which are produced during the war that you can buy for a penny or a shilling or whatever in your local post office. The Bomber Command ones do talk about mine laying because it's an attempt to try and get this information out there to the public. Look, this is important. This is what's going on. Crews are losing their lives. But people are so kind of focused on the immediate results and, the instant, almost gratification is not the right word, but you know what I mean? The instant results of a massive bombing campaign. You can see what's happened the very next day. With mine, then you can't. And I think as well, because it was very successful, but it was seen as a Harris success. And by the end of the war, nobody wants anything to do with Harris because of strategic bombing. He talks about the minelaying campaign in great detail in his dispatch, which is prepared at the end of the war for for general publication. But the Air Ministry knock it on the head that they don't publish Harris's dispatch. All the other sort of leaders, all the other commanders, Navy, Army, whatever, all their dispatches, sort of summaries of the campaigns that they took part in are all published. But they knock Harris's on the head and they won't publish it. Partially because, well, there's a lot of politics, obviously, and within the Air Ministry and within the RAF at this particular point in time. But I think it's also because of that distancing which occurs. I mean, Churchill basically sacks off Bomber Command, doesn't he, after Dresden? And nobody really wants anything to do with Harris, and they're not really interested in anything that he has to say. And I think the mine-laying campaign pretty much gets forgotten about because of that. It gets completely sidelined. Nobody wants to know about Harris. Nobody wants to know about Bomber Command. Therefore, nobody wants to know about this success. And also, I think there's a tendency for people to view it as a naval operation. When you look through the historiography, it's the naval historians who talk about it more than the aviation historians, because throughout it's always seen as a job that the RAF just did for the Navy. But it's absolutely not that. It's the absolute perfect example of joint operation right from the very, very outset of the war. And this is Bomber Command's longest campaign, remember. Right from April 1940, right up to the beginning of May 1945, it continues throughout. And it never, ever gets talked about, never gets any credit.
It's curious because, as you say, it's stuck in that sort of liminal space between sort of a naval operation and an aircraft RAF operation. But you would have thought it was an easy one to, I don't mean an easy one to memorialise. From a memorialisation point of view, it's not necessarily controversial from a Bomber Command point of view. If you were going to memorialise and remember, it's not bombing a city. You know, these are fairly uncontroversial operations. Is it memorialised anywhere? I'm not sure, other than the Bomber Command. I was obviously the Bomber Command Memorial in London, but I'm not sure if there's any memorials to it anywhere else.
No, not particularly. Not to. I mean, there are sort of individual mine-laying crews who crashed and whatever, but there's no sort of specific memorial dedicated to the mine-laying crews. I mean, even if you go to somewhere like the RAF Museum, which is fantastic, or any of the big military museums, you might see it mentioned in passing. There might be like one little board about it or whatever, but that's it. There's no other information about it. It's just not on the agenda. It's
not the radar. And it's funny, that brings me back to the start where people think mine laying. They certainly, if you visit a UK coastal promenade, you see the big red mine, and it's a naval mine. Might not even be from the Second World War, and that sort of, again, it's the wrong mine, potentially the wrong war, that gets remembered.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, people just don't think about it at all, which is one of the reasons why I chose that title for the book, Invisible Campaign, because it's invisible from the historiography. It's invisible in terms of results at the time to the crews who were actually laying the mines, and it's invisible to the enemy. So, yeah.
Invisible Campaign indeed. Well, thank you, Jane. Loyal listener, if you would like to read more about these operations, Jane's excellent book is The Invisible Campaign, Assessing Bomber Command's Minelaying Operations 1940-45. I'll put a link on the website and in the show notes. Now, if you have enjoyed this episode, don't forget you can support the show by becoming a patron at patreon.com/WW2podcast. By becoming a patron, you'll gain access to ad-free episodes, allowing you to fully immerse yourself in every discussion. Plus, you'll unlock occasional exclusive bonus material, which might not have made it into the main podcast. So to sign up, go to patreon.com/WW2podcast. Well, that's it for this episode. So until next time, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our tank, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.